Imagine you're walking into an emergency room, right? And you've got this completely shattered femur.
Ouch. Yeah, that's a bad day.
Right. You are in absolute agony, totally immobilized, bleeding everywhere. And the triage nurse just takes one look at you, hands you this massive, heavy medical textbook on orthopedic surgery, and says, once you read this, pass a written exam and demonstrate that you can walk a mile unassisted, we will gladly give you a hospital bed and set your bone.
I mean, you'd think you were hallucinating.
Exactly. It violates literally every intuitive rule of medicine we have. You can't ask someone to cure themselves as a prerequisite for actually receiving the care.
No, of course not. That would be massive medical malpractice. The entire foundation of healthcare is that the intervention is provided precisely because the patient is incapacitated.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because for decades, that exact paradoxical logic was, well, it was the undisputed gold standard for treating one of the most visible, complex, and just devastating crises in North America.
Yeah, chronic homelessness intertwined with severe mental illness and addiction.
Right. And today, we are taking a deep dive into a massive paradigm shift. We're going to explore a radical inversion of that old system.
It really is an inversion.
It totally is. Like, what happens when a society stops demanding that people, earn their way indoors through sobriety and stability, and instead just hands them the keys to a permanent apartment, unconditionally?
And it's a profound philosophical flip, but more importantly, it's a clinical one. Our goal here today is to really forensically examine the mechanics of this shift.
Yeah, and we have the sources to do it. We've got this amazing comprehensive dossier on homelessness policy.
Right, featuring historical data, the landmark Canadian at-home Chez Soi, randomized controlled trial, HUD policy documents, and some really critical analyses from the Manhattan Institute.
So we need to understand the brutal reality of that 1990s shelter system, the clinical logic that led a few rogue psychologists to just completely flip the script, and those massive trials that proved handing out unconditional leases actually worked.
But we aren't just stopping at the victory lap, are we?
Definitely not. For you, listening to this deep dive, the real mission here is to wrestle with the incredibly thorny, unintended consequences.
Because there are many.
Oh, yeah. We have to look at the present day, where this model has become this rigid federal mandate, and ask a very uncomfortable question.
Right. Can a policy built entirely on the promise of housing actually survive in an era defined by extreme housing scarcity and the lethal reality of fentanyl? To even begin answering that, we have to travel back and look at the system we left behind. We really need to dissect what was universally known as the linear model, or more colloquially, the staircase.
Staircase. Right. So I want you to picture an actual physical set of stairs.
Right.
For most of the late 20th century, the American system basically created a permanent home as the landing at the very top of this staircase.
Right.
If you were sleeping on the concrete, you couldn't just, take the elevator to the top. You had to climb. And every single step was a behavioral test.
And those tests were remarkably stringent, like incredibly demanding. The first rung of that ladder usually meant agreeing to enter a congregate shelter.
And we should clarify, a congregate shelter is not a home.
No, not at all. It is a large room with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of cots. And to just get one of those cots, you had to abide by very rigid rules.
Like, what kind of rules are we talking about?
Well, you had to line up at, say, 3 in the afternoon, submit to personal searches, adhere to a strict curfew, and fundamentally just surrender your autonomy.
Wow. Okay, so let's say you manage that. You stand in line, you give up your stuff, you get the cot. The next rung on the staircase is proving what the system called housing readiness.
Housing readiness. That was the inescapable doctrine of the era. To prove you were ready to move up to the next step, which was usually transitional housing, maybe a group home or a shared room, you had to prove compliance.
What does compliance look like in that environment?
It meant you had to attend mandated group therapy. You had to achieve absolute verified sobriety. You had to prove you're consistently taking your psychiatric medications.
Every single day.
Every day. If, and only if, you demonstrated perfect behavioral stability in that incredibly high-stress shelter environment, you were permitted to climb to the next step.
And if you somehow stayed compliant in that transitional housing for months or even years, eventually you earned the ultimate reward, which was a permanent apartment.
Exactly.
And this wasn't just some fringe local philosophy. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, they codified this exact logic into their 1994 continuum of care. You had to prove your readiness.
Right. It was federal policy.
But I want to pause here and just look at the intuition behind this, because Playing devil's advocate for a second for the listener, the staircase makes a lot of sense.
It does. Intuitively, it makes sense.
Right. It feels responsible. If I'm handing over the keys to a taxpayer-funded apartment, it feels entirely rational to tell a prospective tenant, hey, you need to prove you aren't going to set the place on fire or turn it into a drug den.
Sure.
It's like telling someone they need to take driving lessons and pass a written test before we toss them the keys to a car. Why would any rational society give a permanent, private apartment to someone actively experiencing paranoid psychosis and using heroin without asking them to stabilize first?
What's fascinating here is how that exact intuition, that very logical-sounding analogy of the driving test, it completely disintegrates when we examine the biological and medical reality of severe psychiatric illness on the street.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, the fatal flaw of the staircase model wasn't that it lacked discipline. The flaw was that the people who most urgently needed the housing at the top were structurally, medically, and practically the least equipped to climb the stairs.
I really want to ground this for the listener. Let's look at the day-to-day existence of the specific population we're actually talking about here.
Good idea. Because it's not who people usually picture.
Exactly. We aren't talking about someone who, lost their job, slept in their car for a week, and just needs a security deposit to get back on their feet. The staircase was failing the chronically homeless.
Yes. The defining characteristics of chronic homelessness usually involve years on the street, coupled with severe disabling conditions.
Like what?
We are talking about untreated schizophrenia, severe bipolar disorder, profound physical disabilities, and advanced substance use disorders.
Okay, so imagine you are living with untreated schizophrenia and an active opioid addiction. You're sleeping on a sidewalk under a highway overpass. The elements are punishing. It's 30 degrees at night.
Freezing.
Yeah, and your sleep is constantly interrupted by the noise of traffic, the acute threat of violence, or police sweeps telling you to pack up your tent and move. Your nervous system is just redlining all the time.
Add to that the sheer cognitive exhaustion of deep poverty. When you're on the street, every single calorie, every drop of water, every bathroom break requires a logistical operation.
Right, it's a full-time job just surviving.
Exactly. And in that state of profound physical deterioration and active psychosis, the staircase system arrives and presents its demands.
It says, to get a bed tonight, you must be completely sober. You must take these heavy antipsychotics.
Which, by the way, require food and a stable routine to manage the intense side effects.
And you must navigate the bus system to be back at this specific shelter door by exactly 5:00 p.m.
Right. And for someone in active, untreated psychosis, simply keeping track of time is often neurologically impossible.
I can't even imagine. Managing complex medication side effects when you don't even have regular access to a toilet is a nightmare.
It's undignified and, frankly, dangerous. Fighting off severe opioid withdrawal while adhering to a shelter's rigid behavioral rules isn't just difficult, it's biologically agonizing.
So what happens? The inevitable result is just systemic failure, right?
Yes. The individual misses curfew because they lost track of time. Or they self-medicate their terrifying auditory hallucinations with street drugs because they just don't have access to proper psychiatric care.
Or maybe they act out defensively in the crowded shelter due to a paranoid delusion.
Exactly. And the system's response to these symptoms of their illness is inherently punitive. They fail the test, and they are kicked back down the stairs to the street.
Which triggers a vicious, insanely expensive cycle. They get frostbite, or they overdose, or they have a psychotic break in public.
Right.
They get thrown into the back of an ambulance, taken to the emergency room, stabilized at the cost of tens of thousands of taxpayer dollars, maybe held in a psych ward for 72 hours, and then they're discharged with a people prescription straight back to the concrete.
And every single time they try to engage with this linear staircase and fall backward, it builds a massive psychological wall. The trauma compounds, the disillusionment sets in deep.
You'd just give up.
After enough cycles of trying to meet impossible prerequisites and failing, they simply stop trying. They begin to refuse treatment altogether. From their perspective, the system is rigged.
Because it is rigged. I mean, a staircase that was theoretically built to, quote-unquote, protect scarce housing from people who supposedly weren't ready, ultimately acted as a brutal exclusionary filter.
That's exactly what it became.
It actively screened out the hardest, most complex cases it was nominally designed to help.
The irony is staggering. The criteria for receiving care effectively excluded anyone sick enough to actually need the care.
It brings us right back to that hospital analogy at the beginning. We built a medical system that only admits you if you can prove you are already recovering from your illness on your own in the parking lot?
Yeah, that's a powerful way to put it. And this systemic failure brings us to New York City in the early 1990s.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Well, the staircase model is visibly buckling. The chronically ill are cycling through jails, hospitals, and morgues. And a clinical psychologist named Sam Tsemberis decides to look at this broken linear progression and completely invert it.
So Sembris is working directly with these chronically homeless New Yorkers in 1992, right? The exact people caught in that spinning door of institutional failure.
Yes, he's doing street outreach. He's talking to the people the system has essentially deemed untreatable. And he asks them a very simple question. What do you need?
And the answer.
The answer was universally a place to live, not a shelter bed, not a treatment program, a home.
Just a place to call their own.
Right. And Semperis makes a profoundly counterintuitive observation. He realizes that demanding psychiatric stability as a condition for housing is medically backward.
So he founds an organization called Pathways to Housing. And the model he proposes is jarringly simple. Just give the person an apartment first.
Yes, but we need to be very specific about what kind of apartment.
Yeah.
Not a cot in an armory, not a shared room in a transitional facility.
A permanent, private, scattered site apartment. This means Pathways was going out into the private rental market in New York City, leasing regular apartments in regular buildings spread throughout the community.
They were integrating people into neighborhoods rather than building one giant segregated facility just for homeless individual.
And here's the kicker that just shocked the establishment. No requirements for sobriety. No mandatory drug testing. No required psychiatric groups. The housing is fundamentally unconditional.
Well, the unconditionality applied specifically to behavioral health. The tenants still had obligations, but they were the standard obligations of any renter in the world.
Right, standard lease stuff.
Exactly. First, you had to pay a share of your rent, usually capped at about 30% of whatever income or disability benefits you were receiving.
Okay, and second, you had to agree to meet with a support worker. You just had to open your door and talk to them a few times a month. That was the entire deal.
That was it.
You didn't have to take the antipsychotics they offered. You didn't have to stop drinking. You just had to let them check in.
And you can imagine the backlash from the traditional treatment community was immediate and intense.
Oh, I'm sure they hated it.
They did. The prevailing wisdom of the era was that giving someone with a severe, untreated addiction an apartment was essentially underwriting their self-destruction. Critics argued they would destroy the property or they would isolate themselves and quietly deteriorate out of sight.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Semperis wasn't just handing over keys and disappearing into the night, you know. Housing First is very frequently misunderstood by the public as housing only.
Oh, constantly.
But that is a total myth. Housing First is actually a highly orchestrated, incredibly intensive medical intervention. It's just about wrapping the services around the person after they are safely indoors.
That distinction is the beating heart of the model. Semperis built specialized service structures to support these tendencies.
Tell me about those structures.
Well, for the highest need clients, the folks with the most severe psychotic disorders or the most entrenched addictions, they utilized ACT. That stands for Assertive Community Treatment.
ACT is brilliant. Let's break down the mechanics of it because understanding ACT is vital to understanding why Housing First actually works.
Think of ACT as a hospital ward without walls. Instead of a single caseworker with a clipboard, ACT is a multidisciplinary team.
Okay, so who's on the team?
You have a psychiatrist, a registered nurse, a social worker, a substance abuse counselor, and often a peer specialist with lived experience.
Under the old system, if a homeless person needed all those services, they had to navigate the city on their own, right?
Yes.
They had to take a bus to the psychiatrist on Tuesday, walk to the methadone clinic on Wednesday, and find the social worker's office on Thursday. It was a logistical nightmare that practically guaranteed failure.
ACT flips that entirely. The team comes directly to the client. The clinic is brought to the living room.
Literally brought to the living room.
Literally. If the tenant needs an injection of a long-acting antipsychotic, the nurse brings it to their kitchen table. If they're in crisis at 2 a.m., the ACT team is on call.
And what about the people who aren't in crisis every day?
For clients who didn't need that intense level of psychiatric care, the moderate needs group, they used ICM, intensive case management, where a highly available manager connects the tenant to community resources.
But again, the crucial element is that the ACT team and the ICM case manager are utilizing a voluntary harm reduction approach.
Voluntary is the key word.
Right. They are offering the medication, they are offering the detox bed, but they are not threatening eviction if the tenant says no.
So we have to examine the medical logic driving this. Why sever the requirement of treatment from the provision of housing? Why decouple them?
Because stability precedes recovery. It is Maslow's hierarchy of needs playing out in real-time biology.
Exactly. Let's look at the sheer physiology of living unsheltered. We touched on the nervous system earlier.
Yeah, being in fight or flight.
Right. When you are sleeping on a grate, your amygdala, the fear center of your brain, is locked in a permanent state of fight or flight. Cortisol and adrenaline are flooding your system constantly.
And your sleep is garbage.
Your sleep architecture is completely destroyed. You are living in a state of profound, chronic sleep deprivation, which, by the way, mimics the symptoms of psychosis even in completely healthy brains.
Wow. So how can any rational medical professional look at a human being in that state of neurological chaos and expect them to engage in deep trauma processing?
They can't.
How can you expect someone to manage the complex nausea-inducing side effects of an antipsychotic medication when they don't even have a refrigerator for their food or a private bathroom? How do you go through the agonizing physical withdrawal of opioid detox while living in a tent in the rain?
The clinical revelation of the Tsemberis model is reframing the function of a home. Housing is no longer dangled as the reward you get for completing treatment. Housing is the foundational medical platform that makes the treatment possible in the first place.
Imagine the visceral experience of that transition. Just picture it. You've been living in hypervigilance for 10 years. Every shadow is a potential threat. Someone steals your shoes while you sleep.
It's exhausting.
And suddenly, Sam Tsemberis hands you a key. You walk into a modest apartment. You shut the door behind you. You turn the deadbolt. Click.
That sound must be incredible.
Right. For the first time in a decade, nobody can get to you. You are physically secure.
And the psychological decompression that begins in that exact moment is massive. It takes months, sometimes years, for the nervous system to truly downregulate.
But it finally has the chance to.
Yes. Once that door is locked, once you can sleep for 12 undisturbed hours, once you know your belongings won't be stolen, you finally have the cognitive bandwidth to even begin thinking about addressing a substance use disorder or managing a psychiatric illness.
And the early data coming out of Pathways to Housing in New York absolutely stunned the establishment, didn't it?
It did. Remember, they were specifically targeting the hardest, most entrenched, chronically homeless individuals. The people the staircase model had completely written off as hopeless.
So what were the numbers?
The numbers were undeniable.
Hmm.
Pathways retained roughly 88% of its participants in permanent housing over a 5-year period.
88%. That is huge.
It's massive. Let's contrast that with the standard residential treatment staircase system operating in New York at the exact same time. The programs demanding sobriety and compliance, their success rate was hovering around 47%.
So you invert the model, remove all the behavioral requirements, take the sickest people, and you produced nearly double the housing retention rate.
Yes.
It's an incredible statistic. It's the kind of thing that gets published in medical journals, gets politicians talking, and just launches a massive movement.
But an 88% success rate in one localized New York program, run by a highly charismatic founder, isn't enough to change systemic international policy.
Oh, I'm sure the critics didn't just go away quietly.
No, critics were extremely loud. They argued that Tsemberis must be cherry-picking clients, subtly screening out the absolute worst cases to make his data look good. Or they doubled down on the moral argument, saying that unconditional housing was just state-sponsored enabling of addiction. If you give an alcoholic a free apartment without demanding they go to AA, you're just giving them a comfortable place to drink themselves to death.
The traditionalists firmly believed that without the stick of conditional housing, the threat of the street people would never find the internal motivation to get sober.
Exactly. And to counter that deeply entrenched belief, basic advocacy was not going to cut it. Heartwarming anecdotes about people getting their lives back together weren't going to cut it.
So what did they need?
To truly shift the paradigm across North America, the Housing First movement needed something unassailable. They needed the absolute highest standard of scientific proof available in modern medicine.
They needed a randomized controlled trial, an RCT.
Yes, and for anyone outside the medical field, we really need to emphasize just how monumental this is.
Yeah, lay it out for us.
We hear about randomized controlled trials all the time when it comes to pharmaceuticals, right? If a company wants to bring a new blood pressure medication to market, The FDA demands an RCT.
Right.
You take a large group of people with high blood pressure, and by pure random chance, literally a computer-generated coin flip, half of them get the new drug and half get the standard care or a placebo.
The randomization is the magic ingredient there. Because it's a random coin flip, you eliminate selection bias.
Exactly. You can confidently say that any difference in the final outcomes is due entirely to the drug itself, not because the doctors unconsciously selected healthier, more motivated patients to take the new pill.
But applying that rigorous clinical standard to social policy, especially something as chaotic as homelessness, I mean, that's almost unheard of.
It is wildly expensive, it is a logistical nightmare to track transient populations for years, and it requires tremendous political will. But the Mental Health Commission of Canada decided they were going to do exactly that.
And this brings us to the at-home Chez Soi trial. This ran from 2009 to 2013, and it is the absolute gold standard we have to look at today.
The scale of this operation was breathtaking.
Yeah, we are talking about enrolling between 2,300 and 2,500 homeless adults, all of whom were living with mental illness across 5 major Canadian cities.
They chose cities with vastly different economies and housing markets to ensure the results weren't a fluke. They ran it in Vancouver, Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal, and Moncton.
And they designed the trial incredibly meticulously. They didn't just lump everyone together into one bucket. They stratified the participants by their level of need.
Right. They identified a high-need group. These were individuals experiencing severe psychiatric distress, high utilization of hospitals, and often co-occurring severe substance disorders.
Okay, so the hardest cases.
Yes, this high-need group was randomly assigned. Half got the Housing First model paired with that highly intensive ACT team we discussed. The other half, the control group, was assigned to treatment as usual.
And treatment as usual meant they were left to navigate the existing standard services in their city. They were given the phone numbers for the old staircase model, the crowded shelters, the endless wait lists for transitional housing.
Right, good luck, basically. They also identified a moderate need group. These individuals were still homeless and mentally ill, but perhaps not utilizing emergency rooms quite as often.
And they split them up the same way.
Yes, they were similarly randomized. Half got housing, first paired with intensive case management, or ICM, and half got treatment as usual. And then this army of researchers tracked these thousands of individuals for years, conducting interviews, tracking their housing status, their hospital visits, and their health metrics.
So they wait years. And when the data finally came in, the housing results were just a triumph. There is no other word for it. It proved the New York data wasn't just a fluke.
It certainly wasn't.
The Housing First participants were stably housed approximately 72% of the time.
And compare that to the control group, the folks trying to climb the old staircase. They were stably housed just 30 to 33% of the time.
That is a staggering 40 percentage point gap. And what's remarkable to me is how robust that gap was.
Very consistent across the board.
Yeah, the 40-point improvement held true across both the high needs and moderate needs groups. When researchers sliced the data to look at younger adults versus older adults or different cities, the improvement hovered right around that plus 40 to plus 44 percentage point mark.
It proved definitively that if your primary goal as a society is to get chronically homeless people with mental illness off the concrete and keep them safely indoors, Housing First is vastly, overwhelmingly superior to the staircase model.
It was a home run for housing retention.
It was. In the years since, systematic reviews of multiple trials globally have repeatedly confirmed this, often showing retention rates of 80% or even higher.
But, and this is a massive but for anyone listening who wants to understand the friction we see in our cities today.
This raises an important question.
Exactly. The trial proved that Housing First is an exceptional housing intervention. But remember, the population we are dealing with, these are individuals suffering from severe mental illness and profound addiction. What happened to their health? Did getting a permanent apartment cure them?
This is where we hit the reality check, and the data in the dossier is incredibly sobering on this exact point. While the housing effects were massive and undeniable, the effects on substance use and psychiatric symptoms were modest at best.
Modest at best, wow.
Yeah, they were mixed and in many specific areas statistically uncertain.
The independent, rigorous analyses of the at-home Chez Soi data found that while people's subjective quality of life obviously improved because they weren't freezing outside, there was no significant systemic reduction in their substance use compared to the control group.
And their psychiatric symptoms. The auditory hallucinations, the deep depressive episodes, the paranoia, they did not miraculously vanish just because they had a roof over their heads. The clinical reality is that severe mental illness is chronic.
I'm trying to think of the best way to visualize this for you, listening. It's like, okay, it's like we prescribed a cast for a patient with a broken leg and severe asthma.
Okay, I like this.
The cast worked perfectly. It set the bone, it healed the fracture, the person is walking again, they are housed. But then, as a society, we were incredibly disappointed and confused that the plaster cast didn't also cure the patient's asthma.
That is the perfect analogy. Housing First reliably delivers exactly what its name promises, housing. It provides the stabilization, the physical safety, the locking door, the foundation for survival.
But a locking door is not a pharmacological treatment for schizophrenia.
No, it is not. A lease agreement does not alter the brain chemistry of severe opioid use disorder.
It cured the homelessness. It absolutely did not cure the underlying illnesses that contributed to the homelessness.
And this specific nuance, that Housing First is a wildly successful housing intervention, but fundamentally not a panacea for behavioral health, becomes the absolute crux of the brutal policy debate that followed.
Because armed with this undeniable gold standard RCT data proving that it keeps people off the streets, governments didn't just adopt the model as a new tool in the toolbox, did they?
No, they mandated it.
Which brings us to the federal takeover. We really need to look at how a nuanced clinical model became an unbending national mandate. In 2010, the Obama administration released a landmark strategic plan called Opening Doors.
That was a huge turning point.
It was the moment the federal government fully officially embraced Housing First principles at the highest level.
And in the years that followed, particularly post-2013, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, along with the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, essentially made Housing First the absolute orthodoxy of American homelessness policy.
They took the findings of the Canadian RCT and hardwired them into the federal bureaucracy.
Yes.
But we need to explain exactly how that hardwiring works, because this isn't just about politicians giving nice speeches. It's about the mechanics of federal funding. How did HUD actually force local communities to adopt this?
Well, they embedded it into the scoring rubrics for massive federal grants. Every year, local nonprofits, city governments, and charities apply for HUD's Continuum of Care funding.
And we are talking about billions of dollars here.
Billions. When HUD released its Notice of Funding Availability, the application had a literal point system.
So if an organization submitted a grant application and they checked a box saying, we require our residents to be sober, or we mandate participation in a 12-step program, they lost points.
They didn't just lose a few points, they lost competitive viability.
Wow.
In a world where nonprofits operate on razor-thin margins, losing 10 or 15 points on a federal grant application means you don't get the money.
And if you don't get the money,
You close your doors. When the federal government ties its purse strings so tightly to a specific model, it creates an inescapable gravitational pull.
So local organizations looked at that scoring rubric and realized that if they wanted to survive, they had to pivot to Housing First, regardless of their historical mission.
Yeah.
I have to jump in here and push back on this because I'm struggling with the outrage over this mandate.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the Canadian trial just proved with gold standard, undeniable data that Housing First is 40 percentage points better at keeping people off the streets, why shouldn't the federal government defund the old staircase model?
That's a fair question.
If the 47% success rate programs were failing more than half their clients, isn't defunding the losers and funding the winners just good, rational governance? Why is pivoting the funding a bad thing?
On a macro statistical level, your logic holds. But on a human, systemic level, the issue isn't that Housing First was funded. The issue is the unintended consequence of making it a rigid, one-size-fits-all mandate that actively starved everything else.
Oh, I see.
Policy analysts call this a crowding out effect.
Crowding out the traditional models.
Precisely. The mandate assumed that the ecosystem of homelessness is a monolith, but it's not. Not everyone on the street has untreated, severe schizophrenia and a 20-year history of chronic homelessness.
The population is incredibly diverse.
Very diverse. And crucially, there is a significant subset of individuals who actively want and desperately need abstinence-based, treatment-first environments to survive.
Walk me through a scenario where the Housing First mandate actually harms a client. Like, how does that happen?
Okay, let's consider an individual who has just completed a grueling 30-day inpatient detox program for a severe alcohol or methamphetamine addiction.
All right, so they're clean, but it's early.
They are highly motivated. They are deeply committed to maintaining their hard-won sobriety, but they are incredibly fragile. They have nowhere to go. They need housing.
Okay, makes sense.
Under the old system, they might transition into a sober living facility, a congregate environment where everyone is in recovery, drug testing is mandatory, and there is a shared culture of abstinence.
Right.
It's a safe harbor.
Right, a protective bubble.
But under the new HUD mandate,
Yeah.
those sober living facilities lost their federal funding because they imposed, quote-unquote, barriers to entry, namely sobriety. So those facilities closed.
Leaving the newly sober individual with what option?
Their only option through the city's coordinated entry system might be a scattered site housing first apartment building. Because the building operates on strict housing first principles, there are absolutely no sobriety requirements for the other tenants.
Oh, wow.
So our fragile, newly sober individual is placed in an apartment where the neighbor across the hall is actively using meth, the neighbor below is dealing, and the hallways are a constant trigger.
That is a highly dangerous environment for someone fighting for their early recovery.
It is a recipe for immediate relapse. By starving the transitional, sober living, and treatment first programs of federal funding, the mandate removed vital flexibility from the safety net.
It applied a clinical model designed for the absolute hardest to reach chronically ill population, the folks who wouldn't engage with treatment at all, and just forced it onto every single person experiencing housing instability.
Exactly. And this rigid, unyielding federal mandate sets the stage for a very intense modern backlash.
Which we see playing out right now. Over the last decade, as the reality on the streets in cities like San Francisco, Seattle, and Los Angeles began to visibly deteriorate, critics started asking if Housing First was buckling under the weight of its own unfulfilled promises.
To understand this backlash, we have to examine the most prominent critical voices shaping the current policy debate. The dossier highlights Stephen Ide from the Manhattan Institute, alongside tougher, more hardline critiques from organizations like the Heritage Foundation.
And just to be completely clear with you listening, our job here isn't to endorse a political side. We are looking at Ide as the steelman voice of the critics.
We're just examining the arguments impartially.
Right. He is presenting the strongest, most intellectually robust version of the argument against the current mandate, and we need to understand the mechanics of his critique because it is actively changing legislation right now.
Well, Ide's argument is highly methodical. He actually concedes the initial point on housing stability. He acknowledges the at-home Chez Soi data. If the isolated goal is to get someone indoors, Housing First wins.
Okay, so what's his issue?
His primary critique, it's called behavioral health gap, is that the federal bureaucracy oversold the model to the public as a holistic cure.
Right. Bureaucrats and politicians stood at podiums and promised taxpayers that if we just built the apartments and housed people, the visible addiction and mental health crises would naturally resolve themselves.
But as we saw in the Canadian health data, that is empirically false.
Yeah.
Giving someone an apartment doesn't reliably get them sober.
The asthma cast again.
Exactly. Ide argues that the behavioral health aspect, the untreated psychosis, the active destructive addiction, has been severely neglected. The system essentially declared mission accomplished the moment the lease was signed, leaving deeply sick people to languish indoors.
Which leads right into his next major critique, and arguably the most urgent, grim reality we face today, the overdose era. The introduction of fentanyl changes the entire equation.
It fundamentally rewrites the math of harm reduction. When Sam Tsemberis founded Pathways to Housing in 1992, the street drug landscape was heroin, crack cocaine, and alcohol. Today, the ubiquity of illicit fentanyl has created a lethality that the original model never accounted for.
The critique here is chilling. The argument is that providing unconditional housing, a private apartment with a heavy door that locks from the inside, without highly engaged, mandatory, or extremely accessible treatment, carries a lethal new risk.
In the age of fentanyl, the window between a dose and fetal respiratory depression is measured in minutes.
Just minutes.
If someone is sleeping on the sidewalk and they overdose, they are highly visible. A passerby, a cop, or another homeless person can administer Narcan and save their life.
But if that same individual is placed in a Housing First apartment and they use a loan behind a locked door, there is no one there to administer the Narcan. They just die.
The critics argue that the mandate, by deprioritizing treatment, might be inadvertently trading one tragedy for another. We are moving someone from the visible public risk of the sidewalk to the invisible private risk of dying stably housed behind closed doors.
It is a harrowing critique. And it's forcing public health officials to radically rethink how services are delivered post-housing.
It has to.
And then we crash into the third massive critique, which is the undeniable wall that major cities are hitting right now, the affordability bottleneck. This is the practical, physical limit of the model.
Right. How do you scale a program called Housing First in a city with near zero vacancy and astronomical rents?
You can't. Think about the Canadian RCT. It was a highly controlled experiment. The government had millions of dollars in dedicated rent subsidies ready to deploy. They could afford to go out and secure apartments.
But today, in cities like San Francisco, New York, Toronto, or Vancouver, the housing market is completely broken.
I want to use an analogy here to explain this logistical failure. Mandating housing first in a city with a severe housing shortage is like the federal government passing a law mandating that every single citizen must drive an electric vehicle, but completely forgetting to build any charging stations.
That's a great way to look at it.
Right. The policies is technically sound on paper. Electric vehicles are great. But physically, practically, it is impossible to execute.
You cannot operate a housing-first model if there is literally no housing to give first. The entire model relies on a steady, fluid supply of affordable scattered site units in the private rental market.
And when those units evaporate due to restrictive zoning laws preventing new construction, rapid gentrification, or landlords simply refusing to accept housing vouchers, the entire pipeline just freezes.
So you have this federally mandated policy that requires caseworkers to prioritize permanent housing placements above all else.
Right. But the caseworkers are staring at a computer screen with 0 available apartments. They can't put their clients in transitional sober living because HUD defunded it. They can't put them in permanent housing because it doesn't exist.
It's a gridlock. The model works brilliantly in a clinical setting, but it stalls completely in the real world because the physical infrastructure simply isn't there.
And this bottleneck leads to profound frustration among taxpayers and city residents. They vote for tax increases. They are told billions of dollars are being spent on quote-unquote evidence-based homelessness programs.
Yet they walk outside, and the encampments are larger than ever.
Exactly. The disconnect isn't necessarily that the clinical intervention of housing first is flawed, but that the macroeconomic conditions, the severe housing shortage, render the intervention impossible to implement at scale.
Which brings up the financial side of this debate. Because whenever we talk about billions of taxpayer dollars, we have to look at the cost-benefit analysis.
Definitely. Does the massive upfront cost of providing free, permanent housing actually pay off for the public health system? Because EAD and the Heritage Foundation raise very serious questions about whether this is actually a smart investment.
To answer that impartially, we have to look back at the economic data that came out of the at-home Chez Soi trial. And the cost-effectiveness data is incredibly nuanced.
Lay it out for us.
The short answer to does housing first save money is yes, it offsets major public costs.
Because when you house someone, they aren't utilizing emergency services as much, right?
Correct. They spend drastically fewer days in county jails. They are not taking a $2,000 ambulance ride to the emergency room every 3 days just to get out of the freezing rain.
Right, they have a warm bed.
And they are not cycling through acute psychiatric inpatient beds, which can run $3,000 or $4,000 a night.
So the housing essentially pays for itself by preventing all that chaotic emergency usage.
For a very specific group, yes. The trial data clearly showed that the net savings are strongest for the absolute highest need, chronically homeless subgroup.
The people who are living in the ER, basically.
Yes, these are the superutilizers who are racking up massive public costs while on the street. For them, the cost of renting the apartment and paying the salaries of the ACT team is often less than the chaotic cost of their trajectory through the ER and the jail system.
But let me guess, the math changes for everyone else.
Dramatically. For the lower need populations, individuals who were homeless but weren't constantly utilizing the emergency room or getting arrested, the financial savings are much weaker.
So providing permanent subsidized housing with intensive case management to a moderate need individual is actually a net cost to the system.
It doesn't pay for itself.
It does not.
And this raises incredibly difficult, uncomfortable questions about resource allocation for policymakers. In a world of finite municipal budgets, you have to decide what your goal is.
Are we funding housing first purely as a ruthless cost-saving measure? Because if so, we should only target the top 5% of superutilizers and leave everyone else on the street.
Exactly. Or are we funding this as a fundamental human right, accepting that for the vast majority of folks experiencing homelessness, It is simply going to be an ongoing, massive public expense that taxpayers have to shoulder.
That is the political friction point. The promise that Housing First would pay for itself was largely a myth for the broader population, and critics are absolutely right to point out that discrepancy when budgets are so tight.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. When you look at all these sources together, the brutal history of the staircase model, the undeniable brilliance of Sam Tsemberis' medical inversion, the solid gold standard proof of the Canadian RCT, and the very real structural modern critiques regarding fentanyl and housing scarcity, you don't get a simplistic black and white answer.
No, you really don't. There is no clear hero and villain here. You get a wildly complex ecosystem.
Which requires a very measured verdict. Based on everything in this dossier, we can confidently state what the evidence actually establishes.
And what's the final verdict?
Housing First is definitively proven for what it promises. It is the single most effective intervention we possess for achieving housing stability for the chronically homeless living with serious mental illness.
It works.
The data is robust, it is repeatable, and it gets people indoors.
It builds the foundation.
Yes. However, the critical caveat that the current policy mandates often ignore is that Housing First is necessary, but it is not sufficient.
Not sufficient on its own.
Right. It cannot operate in a vacuum. First, it requires an adequate supply of affordable housing to actually function at scale. You cannot have Housing First without housing.
That's the bottleneck.
Second, and perhaps more importantly, it requires robustly funded, highly accessible voluntary services, deep mental health care, intensive addiction treatment, harm reduction to deliver on its full promise of human recovery.
If you don't fund the treatment side, you aren't doing Housing First. You're just doing residential warehousing.
And that is exactly where the policy debate must pivot. We have to find a way to rebalance the system. We must maintain the vital, life-saving stability that unconditional housing provides without letting rigid federal mandates crowd out the diverse array of sober living and treatment services that individuals desperately need once they're inside.
It leaves us with a profound amount to think about. When you walk away from this deep dive today, I want you to consider the deeply uncomfortable tension between the outward appearance of stability and the internal reality of illness.
It's a tough thing to wrestle with.
It really is. If our policy successfully moves someone off the street, dismantles the visible encampment, and places them into a prominent private apartment, but their internal suffering, their active fentanyl addiction, their untreated schizophrenia, their compounded trauma remains exactly the same, have we actually solved a human crisis? Or have we just solved a public space crisis by moving the tragedy behind a closed door?